what's the mineral that determines whether or not you can fix nitrogen? Molybdenum's the one. And basically, this will not work if you're one of the 80% of people who don't have molybdenum or have enough molybdenum. But if you do have, and so often we'll use something like our 1010 fertilizer or a shuttle 7 or something with high molybdenum in little amounts. It's only tiny amounts that trigger the reaction with this thing to make sure that that's covered. And, you know, in a nitrogen-hungry crop, if you even treat this corn seed with this untreated and treated, it's just chalk and cheese. You've got to actually see it to believe it. It's this to this. By just having a really effective free-living nitrogen fixer who's got molybdenum so they can make the nitrogenase and fix the nitrogen from the atmosphere. Remember, you've got 5,000 truckloads of nitrogen hovering above every hectare, 74,000 tons, the most abundant gas in the atmosphere, and you were supposed to get some of that. And the advantage, I'll repeat myself, the advantage of getting some of that free stuff is that it comes in the ammonium form, and you've got organisms on the leaf that can fix it. You've got straight into the plant, you've got organisms in the soil, and what you're chasing for the resilient, disease-resistant plant is 3 parts ammonium to 1 part nitrate nitrogen in the plant, not in the soil. It's 1 to 1 in the soil, ideally. Never ever quite gets there, but that's what you're chasing. But it's 3 parts ammonium, and that's based upon, the only way you can ever achieve that is if you're fixing it into the leaf from the atmosphere or into the soil from the atmosphere, which is the ammonium form. And if you don't have molybdenum, that's not happening, so you've just knocked yourself down from a resilience perspective. So we've got to get back to getting our ducks in a row to create disease-resistant crops, and molybdenum is a huge part. We work on a large scale in India with coffee growers, and those guys reckon, it seems a big claim, but they reckon molybdenum has basically been the key to them dropping their insecticides for coffee borer. They've never had it wasn't even measurable on the soil test when we started testing. Soil or leaf wasn't measurable, and bringing molybdenum in, being able to create proteins, sulfur as well, and to create resilience made that much difference to them. So just remember that. Potato growers on the Atherton tablelands in the red soils putting out things like 750 kilograms of an NPK phosphate-dominated fertilizer to start a crop, and when they get their first leaf, they analyze it and they're already phosphate deficient. That's how quick the red soils locked it up. The iron oxide grabs hold, 3 positives on iron, 3 negatives on phosphate, and you've got a pretty strong bond of locked up iron phosphate in those soils. And so these kind of materials can be utilized in that instance to release that phosphorus, and that's what they do. They're phosphate solubilizing bacteria, specialists that go in and do the job, and you can brew these. So there's also, we mentioned specialist organisms that live on the leaf surface and can fix nitrogen. Now the difference between the 2 most abundant minerals, which is nitrogen followed closely by potassium, is that potassium's only sourced through soil solution, whereas nitrogen is coming from the soil. It's also coming directly in from the leaf. So when you get dry conditions, the very first thing, you think it's going to be nitrogen because it's most abundant, but it's not. The very first thing that suffers is potassium, because potassium's only source, it's not coming in through the leaf, it's only sourced through soil solution, and there is no soil solution because it's dry. And so you see in broadacre crops that dry finish, which is this little burning edge on the lower leaves of the crop, which is a classic sign of a potassium shortage. And that's when you need potassium because its size is grain, it's the money mineral, and that's when you foliar spray potassium. And people haven't sort of traditionally used potassium sulphate because it's got a low solubility. It's only 1 kilo per 10 litres of water, where urea is 1 kilo per 1 litre of water. And people say, oh, it's not worth worrying with. Well, it is, because you only need 8 kilos of potassium sulphate as a foliar, and you bring in some sulphur for protein as well, and you put some fulvic acid with it, and that creates potassium fulvate, about 200-300 grams per hectare. And that is just a wonderful potassium money mineral that you've brought into the equation in a dry finish, and it makes the difference between a good year and a bad year. And you can monitor that, as we mentioned with potassium, by measuring top leaf and bottom leaf. That's why a potassium meter is an invaluable tool, because you measure the top leaf, it's the most mobile mineral, it's moving to where it's required, which is actually for vegetative growth at the top, and for sizing seeds, which are also at the top of the plant. And basically, you need to test the top with a meter and test the bottom, and they need to be the same. Might be 2,000 parts per million in both places. And if the bottom's 1,500, if it's more than 10% variation, that always is a potassium deficiency, and you need to come in and fix that, because potassium determines your profitability. So you can do that with a pH strip. If you can't afford a meter, it's not as reliable. but basically you want to have the same color. So you've got one pH strip, and you squeeze with the garlic crusher a couple of drops out of the top part of the plant, and you look at the shade that's created when you drop it onto that pH strip, and then you take leaves from the bottom of the plant, and if it's more acidic, potassium is a superalkalizing mineral, and because of its mobility, it becomes more acidic when it departs that lower leaf, and that's what you're measuring if there's a change in color. If it gets darker on that second drop on the other half of the strip, that's usually a potassium shortage that you've picked up on. So it's really cheap, costs you 50 cents a strip. It's a really, really good strategy. Because potassium is a vegetative mineral, so it's required for the growing tips and for the whole vegetative oomph. But, it depends on, usually you've planted and you're hoping you've got enough moisture and you run out at the end very typically in something that's not irrigated. And that's where it becomes really important. So basically the big drawdown, and it's ridiculous if you've got a potassium meter, you won't actually believe your eyes, because you can be ticking along at 2,500 parts per million. The crop flowers, the wheat crop or the corn crop or whatever flowers, and maybe 5 days after that flowering, you come in and do another, then there's basically 2,500 becomes 900. There's that much sucking of potassium. It's the reproductive mineral. It's what determines the size of everything. It pumps sugars into things to size them up. And that's what you're selling. The bigger, the more size you've got, the more weight you've got, the more money you've got. So that's why I call potassium the money mineral. And it's really important in a dry finish after flowering. That's when you almost always got to come up with some potassium to counter the requirements, the drawdown of potassium that's not there because there's no soil solution, and that's where it comes from. So lodging, of course, for those who are not familiar with the terms, is when the crop falls over because the stem strength is not there, and very commonly that is exactly linked to potassium. It's one of the bigger players in governing stem strength, but it also can be silica, less often but quite commonly. And so potassium silicate is a really neat foliar spray in that context because it covers both of the options, and you only need small amounts in broadacre. I've seen crops, you spray potassium silicate at, say, 1.5 litres a hectare, even 1 litre a hectare, and you could push down that crop and it stays down, and 3 days after spraying potassium silicate, you push it down, it goes doink. That's what you want. You want that stem strength and that result, that bounce back. If you get strong winds that would otherwise push it over, you want it to pop back up again, and potassium silicate can be used for that purpose. Now, the other thing, of course, that can determine stem strength, the one other thing is copper. Copper deficiency will give you a weak stem strength as well. So if you've read my blog, you might have read the interviews with Stefan Timmermans, who's probably the leading agronomist in Holland. He is the most passionate. He'll stand up in the class and say to other groups, he'll come along to my courses in different countries because he'll fly over, he's a mate, and he'll stand up and say, I want you growers to understand this, that you check your agronomist's fingernails now. If he hasn't got dirt under them, he's down the road, he's a waste of space. You've got to be in the soil looking and seeing what's happening. And he just runs around paddocks because he's a long distance runner, and he literally runs to get round. He's never lost a client. Every client he's ever had, even though some of them are 80 now, won't let him go. And now he's getting all these huge growers of berries in Scotland just paying him a fortune to come over, and he doesn't drop them. So he starts at 4 in the morning and goes to late at night running. He's a lunatic, but passionate beyond anything you've ever seen. He is the most passionate character ever. He uses potassium meters consistently, particularly in his berry production. And what the berry guys are finding is that you want that loading that you're talking about. So instead of having equal amounts of potassium in the bottom and top leaf, they go for having like as much as 50% more stacked in the bottom. So that you've got this, when you've got something that's drawing and producing fruit for a long period, you stack it with potassium in the bottom, and you want to have a higher level of potassium in the lower leaf. When I was in India, back when I could travel, and I find this article in an ag magazine of this professor, this woman, who had looked back through ancient Ayurvedic texts and so forth and found this parchment from 3,000 years back describing how Indian agriculture worked at that point. And it's really interesting to look back and to understand that very often there's nothing new under the sun, because according to this document, Indian agriculture on that point worked on 4 lacto-fermented formulas. So here we have the power of lacto-fermentation, which is what you just learned how to do, to extract the actives out of anything. So for example, I go garlic. We mistakenly didn't realize how nice the scapes, you know what the scape is? It's the flower that grows from the top of the garlic. And we decided we'd probably belatedly, not probably, definitely belatedly, we got thousands of them, a big planting of garlic. that Claudia decided to pickle some of them. So we pickle some of these skates. Oh my God, have you ever eaten pickled skates before? They're nicer than pickled garlic. They're mind-boggling. So then I thought, gee, well, if they taste so good, they probably are good. And so I researched them, and they've actually got as much, some say more nutrition than the wonderful nutrition, including allicin, is found. Of course, it makes perfect sense. The plant is producing a flower, and everything goes into the flower. So of course it'll be good, and we just left it sitting there. So I thought, well, I'm not going to waste this. So we harvest these thousands of scapes, and we put them in 1,000-litre tanks. We put them through a mulcher, and we ferment them all with some BAM and molasses, and it takes whatever time it takes to get down to 3.5, and you've extracted the active ingredients, and that's a really nice foliar fertilizer and insect resistant thing, because allicin works quite powerfully for that, from that perspective. So back to the Indian story, 4 formulations that crops were grown upon to feed that one of the most ancient of all civilizations. One of them was to brew using 4 herbs. One of them was hibiscus, interestingly, a form of hibiscus. Some were 4, some were 5 herbs, lacto fermented to extract the actives from them. One of them was for nitrogen-fixing organisms. One was for phosphate solubilizing organisms. The third was for potassium solubilizing organisms. And guess what the fourth was? For silica solubilizing organs 3,000 years ago. The flavor of the month was known about way before we started talking about it. So it's fascinating in that context. And it shows you, and that's why I'm so much of a fan of this lacto fermentation. So we've taken old garlic and we've made garlic sprays. When you look, you Google the potential of lacto fermented garlic sprays, and you won't actually believe your eyes, because you know the story of sulfur compounds is everything about plant resilience. Every aspect of how a plant protects itself and consequently grows better is based on sulfur-based compounds, and garlic is just filled to the brim with them, and you extract those with lacto fermentation. Or in the case, but next year we're not going to use the scapes for that, because they're too nice to eat. So we bought garlic peeling machines, and we've got lots of garlic up there, and Claudia's got this great recipe, and we're using our wonderful apple cider vinegar that's the same formula. We did all these trials of different blends of apples to decide on the one that won the best cider in the country, and I reckon we got the best apple cider in the country because it's the same blend, and it is to die for. And we're going to use that with the garlic to make pickled garlic. And she's already did some trial work, and my Italian farm manager said, I want to order 10 jars now. That's the best I've ever tasted. So it's real, and he's a garlic lunatic. He eats garlic all the time. So anyway, that's just digressing, as always. This is interesting. This is the concept of diseases that affect just insects. So it's actually a disease called white and green muscadine disease, and it just gives a furry coating of fungal spores. It gets in through any opening, including the breathing pore on the insect, and then it eats them from the inside out, and then it bursts like an alien from that body, and the whole insect is there. The caterpillar's on the top covered in this fur, and that fur is millions of spores. And so if you've got wind and moisture, particularly wet conditions, such as for cane grub, for example, and if you've got nice wet soils up north, it can spread those spores throughout, and it just kills that grub with that disease. There's concerns about whether it can affect bees, and it doesn't seem to be too bad. You don't spray it while they're there, because then they get the spore directly on them, and there's a risk. It doesn't affect humans, doesn't affect anything except insects. But of course, you sometimes don't want to take out the good guys, obviously, so you've got to be a little careful with the use of those materials. It can be in the soil, which is probably for killing things that are a problem in that context, but usually used as a foliar spray, and it's called mycophores, 3 key organisms who are also now recognized to be doing other things. Nothing does one thing, so it's not just that you're controlling an insect. Now you find there's this plant growth stimulating effect and immune enhancing response, and there's a whole new group of studies around the 3 organisms present in that one. They thought that it was going to be perfect, this, for termites. They thought, well, this is going to control termites, white ants, which I've had some in my house and I just get rid of recently. Still got to repair the stairs where they ate them out. But basically, what they found was that they're so smart that they identify the guys that have got it, and they wall them off until it dies out. So it doesn't work for them. They're too smart. And this is the wonderful mycorrhizal fungi, several strains of it, combined with trichoderma and some of these bacillus species. And this is used as a seed treatment, or the very best way to get mycorrhizal collination colonisation is to take, say, a 200 tray seedling, or to take your tree seedlings before you plant them and to dip them into this powder mixed into a solution, and then all 200 seedlings have instantly, as soon as it stops bubbling, it's only a case of a few seconds, you've got colonisation. And that's, you know, the 100% colonisation efficiency of using a platform. Now you say, can I boom spray it out on the paddock? Yeah, you can, but the spores and what are called propagules, the little pieces of hyphae, are also food sources for other organisms, and there's an enzymatic reaction when they touch a root that boom, they're alive, and bang, they join onto that root and start expanding out and giving you that 10 times the original root surface area. And basically they can get eaten before they get to the root, and so their efficiency is way down unless you can get it directly on the root. Now some people will drill and get it around the roots on established avocado trees or whatever, but the seedling thing is the most efficient. Second most cost effective is just seed treatment, and you don't have to do enough to cover the entire paddock if you can't afford it in broadacre. You can do $10 worth, and your return on investment for $10 is really, really good. I mean, we've done the trials, it's really, really good return on investment. You might only get 25% of the crop that's colonised, but you're there, it spreads from one to the next to the next. Of course, you know, it takes 6 weeks to expand out, so you don't get everything covered and everything with its full-size root thing, but you've got the start of the process. If you don't bomb them out, like on the pasture, say that you're putting in some oats into a pasture that dies off and you want to have some green, so you're direct drilling your pasture crop and you're putting in some oats, so you've got some green. You put the platform on those oat seeds, and that will just spread through. And in a pasture scenario, hopefully you're not doing too many things like methyl bromide and strawberries or something that are going to kill it off. And once you've got it, you got it. You don't keep re-inoculating it. You've now got this matrix across the paddock of this wonderful organism. It's just a case of getting it, and you can check and test. Have I got mycorrhizal fungi in this test? You can have done to check, but it's one hell of a thing to have in place. You know, reaches out and grabs the immobile minerals like phosphorus, as we mentioned, and zinc. It drives into clay platelets and mines out the potassium that sometimes can be trapped within clay platelets, because it's a very small ion potassium, and it can trap it, it can get between the plates like a sandwich. Has to ooze out of the sandwiches before you can access it, but the hyphae of mycorrhizal just go in and mine it, which is a pretty cost-effective thing for getting potassium. But so many benefits, including the big one from a planetary perspective, which is the concept of the production of the sticky carbon-based substance called glomalin, produced, if you look here, by the glomallis strain, which is one of the strains in here, the most common strain in every soil. And glomalin is now known to be the triggering mechanism, we've already talked about this, for 30% of all the humus in soil, one organism that's lacking. So for God's sake, why wouldn't we say, look, here's $10, you know, or whatever, maybe $40 to cover a paddock completely. Why don't we give government subsidies to do something that's going to build humus on that scale? It's kind of a no-brainer. It's arguably the most important creature on the planet, so I'm keen on that one. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the substance called wood vinegar. And my belief, and I don't just believe it, I know it, that wood vinegar will become one of the 4 essentials in regenerative agriculture in the quite near future. Why am I being so demonstrative about this substance? First of all, explain what it is. Who's heard of wood vinegar before? Most, not most, but half of you. So let's explain it. So biochar, we mentioned, it was discovered as it's called pyrolysis, where you burn the wood without smoke coming off, and that creates this sort of half-finished sort of material called biochar. Sort of when you do a hungy, if you're in New Zealand, that's kind of creating biochar because it's all happening beneath ground, it's sealed in. But with biochar, you have these closed containers that burn the wood, or whatever the base material is. And what was discovered was that you can capture the smoke condensate. It's actually called a smoke condensate from the burning of the char. So all of the volatile compounds, and there are over 200 of them in the wood that you're burning, and it varies between different woods that you burn. Moringa's amazing. Hemp is ridiculous. Makes one of the best biochars in the world. So it varies totally upon the materials that you're using, but all of them have over 200, and some have more active things like phenolic compounds and so forth. They get condensed into the smoke condensate, which is a liquid, and one of the components that's present in all wood materials is acetic acid, hence the term wood vinegar, because it's there in reasonable amounts and the pH is only 3.5 or 3.2, and so we call it wood vinegar. It's just a slang name for what is actually technically called a smoke condensate. Now, one of the guidelines to how good these are, because they vary completely, is the presence of these substances called karrikins. Now, the word karrick, K-A-R-R-I-C-K, is an Aboriginal word for smoke. And the Aboriginals, of course, have known about this forever, that you burn off and the smoke triggers the germination of a whole range of native seeds that wouldn't have otherwise germinated. So that controlled burning had a purpose to regenerate and bring in that biodiversity by triggering. Obviously, it was part of, it had always been forever on this ancient continent. Smoke had been part of the scenario that triggered the germination. But what's been found since is that these substances called karrikins that trigger that do much more than triggering germination. They're actually plant growth stimulants. They trigger and trigger germination of most species, not just a handful of natives. And the percentage of karrikins in a wood vinegar is one of the guidelines as to its ability, as to its potential. So with wood vinegar, basically you're using it quite diluted, usually like 1 to 300, 1 to 400, 1 to 500, and you can use it as a seed treatment, and it's a really, really good seed treatment and really inexpensive. It can control fungal diseases, it controls insects. We use it as part of a recipe. We also use micronized diatomaceous earth, which is super abrasive and the insects hate it, and you put some wood vinegar with it. Really effective on snails and slugs. In fact, in South Australia, where you've got these tiny snails that just totally clog up your gear when you're trying to harvest in broadacre, they just spray it on them. We don't know so that you can put it on them and they don't die, but they won't come near it. And if you put it with a wet sticker, the smell stays there. And maybe the Australian landscape's learned that you don't go where there's a smell of smoke, because if you put the stuff on your hand and leave it for half an hour and then wash it off, for the next 2 days people say, oh, you've been burning off, have you? Because you smell like smoke. It's just really, really concentrated smoke smell. So maybe that's some of what's happening. It's not really well researched. The Thai government has been right into it, just like the Filipinos with trichoderma, and they're saying this is the way you grow stuff, and they've made it best practices to use these wood vinegar materials. And so from my perspective, there's a product, just so you know, we checked all the products in the country, and there are 4 or 5. There's a product called Pyroag, which was by far the best, and my distributor in South Australia had been using this Pyroag and getting this. In fact, I'm interviewing him on my most recent podcast. And so we tried things and nothing was good. So I went to Pyroag and then said, rather than you having a competitor, can I take your product, wholesale prices, rebrand it, sell it probably the same price you're selling it, but we're buying it in big amounts, and we rebrand it and call it a Nutritech product, because I don't usually do that, but I'm not going to sell anything other than our product name and our branding. He said, nah, we've created this product. We've got a brand name that people recognize, for those that even know what wood vinegar is. And we're not giving it to you. And I said, well, it just means you're going to have a competitor. You would have had 2 bites of the cherry, now you get 1, and we're going to compete with you. And they had a meeting against it. No, we can't do it. So then we checked, we got import permits, and we brought, I think, 4 or 5 different, you've got to wait to get the permit and then bring them in and pay for the permit, then do all the trials on those little beds. And we found one that was actually made from, because apples have been declining in popularity, because I don't know, a variety of reasons, but their apple orchards have been pushed out globally, and this was made from the apple trees, which you use for smoking along with cherry wood, because there's so many volatile compounds and the flavour comes through in the smoke. I thought that'd be pretty good, and it was. It outperformed the 4 others that we brought in, and so I brought, I think, 20,000 litres. It's just the first buy. And then I thought, gee, I better check it. How stupid. This is the sort of mistakes that I make all the time. How stupid. I thought we better check it against Pyroag, because I'm not selling something unless it's at least as good. So we just kept on doing trials, and every time Pyroag beat us by about 20%, sometimes 25%. I said, okay, let's doctor ours up so it'll be better. But by the time we put wonderful things like tricontin and Volvic, to get it as good or not better, it costs much more than what we could afford to sell it for. We couldn't even be competitive. So I just had to I went back to them, said, you sure you won't? No, we won't do it. And so I gave up. And then the last of these courses that I had, which was over a year ago, maybe 18 months ago, the last one we had in the midst of COVID, maybe even more, there's a guy who'd been, basically my age, spending 30 years making biochar. He said, look, I make a pretty good wood vinegar. I've had it checked by this guru from Newcastle University who'd been doing all Pyroag's work, and he said it's the best he's ever tested. And my mate makes a good one. Can I send him down 20-litre drums and you could do the test? So we go through the whole replicates and testing. And his mate's one was as good as Pyroag, and ours was about 25% better. And I said, you beauty. And that's just come out today. So that's what it's called, activated char condensate. That's it there. It's a unique claim to fame, is that I always want to have a point of difference. He's developed a way that he could put micronized biochar. Usually it's a golden urine coloured substance. This is black because he's included micronized biochar into it. So if you look at the research of biochar and wood vinegar together, that's the kick-ass response, and that may well be what's happening. But one of the trials we did down here, admittedly it was at high rates. We used 5 mils per square metre of the various products, and we used the microbiometer, and 5 mils per square metre is 50 litres per hectare, so that's a whack of stuff for you to afford to put out. But just to see what would happen, we went from 500 on a microbiometer to 1700, and I've never seen that in my life. So it's one hell of a biostimulant. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's a remarkable biostimulant, and because, you know, what the Thai government talk about is its response as a fungicide and a pesticide at 1 to 100. Well, you can't use pyrrhig. In fact, you can't use any wood vinegar at 1 to 100 because the pH is 3 and you burn stuff. You can't go below 1 to 250. But you can with this because the biochar component, the micronized biochar, lifts the pH. It's not 3.5, it's 6.2, and you can put it at 1 to 50 if you want to, but 1 to 100 can now be used a litre per hectare and broadacre, which you could never do previously. You can only use a few hundred mils, and you can get wonderful responses, including for fungicidal and insecticidal responses. So that perhaps you understand my enthusiasm in terms of suggesting, if you look at the research, just Google wood vinegar research, and you won't believe your eyes. It is something really, really special.